Bloomberg Tech is live from coast to coast with Caroline Hyde in New York and Ed Ludlow in San Francisco.
This is Bloomberg Tech. Coming up, Nvidia and AMD agreed to pay 15% of their revenues from Chinese AI chip sales to the US government.
Plus, Intel CEO Lip-Bu Tan is set to visit the White House today, just days after President Trump called for his resignation.
And lithium prices and stocks spike after CATL halts operations at a major mine in China.
But we return to these public markets. And Ed, this is an entire show really focused on the semiconductor world. So I bring you the chip sector in particular. And I'm looking at the stocks, of course, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index is currently up almost a percentage point. We're coming off of our highs, but really a focus on the macro picture right now. We're near record highs for stocks. Bonds waver. We're looking at inflationary data, but we on this show are looking at semiconductors. Dive into them for a moment.
There are so many chip stories. Micron is raising its guidance for the current period because of pricing power, particularly in DRAM. There's a lot going on in high bandwidth as well. Intel is up 4.8%. Its CEO, Lip-Bu Tan, is off to the White House to meet with President Trump. We'll bring the reporting later in the hour. Then the top story. Nvidia and AMD, according to a Bloomberg source, have agreed to give the United States 15% of any revenues from chip sales to China, AI chip sales to China, in exchange for export licenses in what is a very clear quid pro quo. Caro.
It is unprecedented, many people say. Let's get out to Bloomberg Balance of Power host Joe Matthew, whom we welcome to the show for the perspective of the administration. Why do this, Joe?
Well, boy, it's a great question. It is unprecedented, remembering the golden share that the White House scored in the Al Nippon takeover of U.S. Steel. This is a whole new level, and it's raising a lot of questions, beginning here in Washington, at least, with national security. Wall Street might have slightly different questions here, but of course, remembering that these chips were going to be off limits to the Chinese, and it's something that we've talked about a lot here on the air. That was only a couple of weeks ago. Then you saw the turn to making them available. The licenses, even after that moment, were not actually being given to Nvidia or AMD for a couple of weeks. So this apparently unlocks the license. But my goodness, the role that the administration is now playing in business, I think we can say openly that the U.S. government is now part of the semiconductor industry. They're invested in the business. And the big question is, where's the line? If 15% is enough to get the H-20s on sale in China, is there a number that Jensen Huang can come up with to sell even more?
I want to point out that AMD has not said anything about this reporting. It was first the FT, then it was us. Nvidia has said something. They've said a lot, actually, but they haven't addressed the 15% number, to your point, Joe. What they've indicated is that so far, at least I think in this fiscal year, they haven't shipped any H-20s to China. So that's important for Wall Street to kind of model for. But boy, they're kind of indicating that they're getting what they want in some sense, because China is such a key market. And the president seems right now, if this reporting is accurate, to be willing to oblige them because he's getting something in return. He's done a deal.
That's right. He's done a deal. And this is the same president who just days ago, of course, asked for the resignation of the Intel CEO. As you mentioned, Lip-Bu Tan is at the White House today. And it had us last week asking the question if President Trump is, in fact, the chairman of the board at any major company. We've seen him do this before, calling for boycotts of certain goods, calling for personnel changes, calling for policy changes within companies. You've certainly seen the impact that he's had when it comes to DEI. But actually exchanging money with these companies is a whole new prospect, and it's unclear exactly where this 15% would go. Will that be used to pay down the debt or do something else in terms of national security? We have a lot of questions that remain. The president, by the way, is briefing reporters right now at the White House, talking about crime here in the city and his effort to federalize Washington, D.C. It's a very separate and big story here, but they will go to questions, Ed, and I suspect that these will come up today.
We suspect so, too. Bloomberg Balance of Power host Joe Matthew, thank you very much. Let's get more on the reaction to the Nvidia and AMD deal with Riva Goujon. She's a director at Rhodium Group, an independent research firm that analyzes economic and political issues, including those relating to China. Riva, you have more than 2 decades of experience as a geopolitical strategist, advising companies on what on earth's happening around the world. Have you ever seen the United States impose what is essentially an export tax in exchange for those companies being able to export technology to a specific market?
Well, unorthodox is an understatement here, right? And there's that whole pesky detail of what about Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution that says no tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state, meaning any part of the U.S. government, to include the executive branch. So, yeah, we're in uncharted territory here, but it does fit with a highly transactional administration. But as you just referenced earlier, what is exactly the line here? If the administration is driving toward revenue generation, not just in trade policy with tariffs, but even in export controls, right, to include high-end semiconductors, what's the line on what is considered too advanced, right, as it balances against this revenue generation goal?
Let's just repeat that now we've heard from Nvidia. We are hearing from AMD as well, saying that an initial China licenses have indeed been approved, and AMD in confirming it received the China AI chip export licenses, and something that we quizzed Lisa Su on just last week after her earnings, and it's what the market really wanted to hear about, Riva. But go further a little bit here as to ultimately companies looking to sell into China, thinking longer term whether they'll remain to have access. The response from China thus far has been one of concern about, well, the amount of information and so-called back doors they've been questioning, particularly with Jensen Huang.
Well, Trump has made himself intrinsic to the U.S.-China chip wars. So now we need to see how far this actually goes. Liputan is going to be in the White House. Can he pull off a Jensen? That still remains to be seen, but Intel has a lot of problems attached to it. And there is an American imperative to create an American chip champion out of, Intel's setbacks. And so I think there's a lot more deal making to come out of that as well. But, with this level of transactionalism, there's always a degree of uncertainty of how long does this actually last? If we are applying a sliding scale to chip sales to China, then at what point does that start to retrench as US-China AI competition is undoubtedly intensifying? We're still in the early stages of AI diffusion. As we start to see more of these physical AI applications become more real, right? As we wrap our heads around that, as we wrap our heads around the competitiveness issues around that, the critical inputs where China still has intense leverage, will we start to see a delayed reaction in the US, that freak out moment, so to speak, where these kinds of controls could fall back to a more restrictive nature?
Riva, push us forward. How's the American president decided to forego national security concerns for $1 billion at least per quarter coming in from Nvidia, if our math is right, on what 15% earns them? Or do you think that they can manage to in some way location track and understand what really ultimately gets into the Chinese tech stack and how it is used?
Well, there are a couple different issues here, right? H20s are optimized for inference compute. So the assumption that the administration is making here is that inference compute is not the chief national security concern. Now, that raises a question, again, if Huawei is able to produce comparable chips to Nvidia or AMD, will we see U.S. chip controls ease, right, to allow U.S. technology complete head-to-head with Huawei? So again, where is that line drawn? But still, we're in a highly transactional phase here, and so we need to see just to what degree is the U.S. going to be concerned about those end uses. And again, the economic competitiveness concerns are still in play here.
I don't know. H20 can be used for training. It's had performance engineered out of it. But I know, talking to a lot of people inside the company, there are lots of questions here. You said something a minute ago, doing a Jensen or pulling a Jensen. I find that so interesting because his principal argument, in line with what we've just debated about H20, is if you don't export American technology, China will use a domestic champion's technology. And then they'll start exporting it to other international markets. Forget the revenue side of this for a minute. Is this smart by Trump to kind of have the PR effect of allowing them to export technology to an economic adversary and at the same time doing a deal, showing that he's got something out of it?
It's a slippery slope. And as we're seeing the preparation for a U.S.-China summit between Trump and Xi, What is Beijing thinking at this point? Obviously, it wants to take advantage of this highly experimental transactional phase. So what is it going to push for? We know they're pushing for an easing of the 20% fentanyl tariffs. On the chip controls front, they're going to want to push for an easing of high bandwidth memory chip restrictions. Now, that's really tricky, right? Because if you start to say, okay, because Chinese memory chip makers are becoming competitive in this domain, that the US will allow Micron, for example, Samsung, SK, to export these chips to the US. That doesn't help Nvidia because Huawei is getting access to HBM chips that are going to improve its production, right? So you see a selective application of that sliding scale approach. And the US so far is also not easing semiconductor manufacturing equipment controls, right? So the tools to actually make those chips. If the US imperative is to throttle Chinese chip production, really constrain that so that US companies like Nvidia and AMD can flood the zone in the Chinese economy, right, get the Chinese technologists addicted, so to speak, to US tech, you don't necessarily want to help Huawei, right, in its production either.
How do you anticipate China's going to respond to this?
Well, China has a ton of leverage at this point with the critical raw material, the rare earth licenses. And if you look at comments from USTR recently, Jameson Greer, and what you can see from those talks is that that issue of licensing for critical input seems to be a major theme of the US-China bilaterals. So if the US, raises threats on tariffs or raises technology controls in any significant way, China can basically say, look, the terms of Stockholm or whatever European capital, they're off and you're not getting your licenses and your production lines are going to be paralyzed, and good luck with your manufacturing ambitions, right? For this big AI renaissance, for your manufacturing renaissance, we hold the cards. And at least for the duration of the Trump term, that is an uncomfortable truth.
Riva Goujon, Director at Rhodium Group. Fascinating to talk to you. Thank you. Now, coming up, Intel CEO Lip-Bu Tan, we just mentioned it, reportedly going to be meeting with President Trump today. That story's next, Ed. What are you looking at?
Yeah, I'm going to take another look at Micron because shares are pushing higher again. They've upped their guidance for the current period, saying that adjusted EPS will be up to $2.92. Previous end of their guidance at the top range was $2.65, but it's all about kind of favorable DRAM pricing because margins also looking better as well. Again, this is a company that wants in on this great build out in data center in particular, but its historic business has been so commoditized and cyclical, but investors in this moment really liking what they're seeing. Micron up 3.5%. We'll be right back. This is Bloomberg Tech. Intel CEO Lip-Bu Tan is set to visit the White House today. This just days after President Trump called for his resignation due to potential conflicts of interest. Bloomberg's Ian King joins us. You've also kind of gone deep on where Lip-Bu fits in right now with Intel's strategy with the White House. But what do we understand that he will be discussing with President Trump when he's in DC later today?
Yeah, I mean, it's still TBD, obviously, but there's an awful lot going on in Washington right now regarding chips. But fundamentally, what the Trump administration wants is an affirmation that all of these projects, all of this physical building of semiconductor plants in the US is going to go ahead. They don't want any sense that, oh, maybe we will, maybe we won't. And that has been the message that kind of Intel have delivered recently, because from Wall Street's perspective, we don't want to build these factories until they can actually fill them. So there's kind of a push and pull there, where their investors want one thing and frankly the White House wants another. So the topic has got to be, how do we get the two sort of positions closer together? What kind of language can Intel come up with that will keep the White House happy and also not scare investors?
Ultimately, Ian, what would scare investors? A lack of access to the CHIPS Act money, a pullback more broadly from fabrication in the US, or is it more worrying that they're going to be plowing money in before the demand is certain?
Right, investors really don't care where chips are made. They care whether the companies who are making them are making money or not. Building plants when you don't have orders is not a good way to make money. It's a way for your company to go out of business. So that would be their position. Ultimately, though, there is a lot of realism out there. And obviously, as we're discussing, the supply chain is becoming more complicated and the geopolitical imperatives are becoming stronger and stronger. So there will be some understanding that, hey, maybe we do need to build out capacity, but Intel has a lot of capacity in the US already. So why does it need to build these mega factories unless it has orders? What they want from Intel, more than anything else, is, hey, we've got some giant customers who want to use our factories. The moment Intel cannot say that.
Ian King, always across the reporting. We thank you so much. For more on Intel and look the broader chips sector, Joanne Feeney's with us, Advisors Capital Management Partner, Portfolio Manager. Joanne, what is it that you would like to see Lip-Bu manage to navigate today? Is it better that he promises more investment into the US, more manufacturing, and that he has extricated himself from China? Or ultimately, does he even need to stand down in some way as CEO?
Yeah, it's really unclear, Caroline. Obviously, I think he can defend himself from the concerns that he's conflicted, and that's his main mission today. I don't know if that means he needs to do more to separate from his prior work and investments. I don't know how much capacity he has to do that. I think Ian is right that the administration wants to be able to continue to push the narrative that they are doing something to bring more chip manufacturing back to the U.S. And so his announcements of less investment or delayed investment, is a concern to the administration, but they don't have the customers yet. Maybe he can say, hey, we've got these guys on the line, we're reeling them in. Maybe that would be reassuring. But ultimately, Intel needs to keep those subsidies, but not at the cost of having to spend so much CapEx in the near term when they don't have customers. So a very fine line for the CEO to walk here.
The stock's up 6%, so the market likes something about the idea that Lip-Butan's going to go to DC and meet with the president. Present day, you're a fund manager looking all across tech, but you had a long career in semiconductors. Lip-Butan also has had a very long career in semiconductors. A lot of this affiliation with China or indirect affiliation has been well known. Were you aware of it? Do you understand his history?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know him that well, but I think the public information about his prior work is pretty clear. He's obviously very highly respected. He was brought in by the board to take Intel in a different direction, one that is more measured, less capital spending forward than Pat Gelsinger wanted to do. And so it's just worrisome, right, that he might have to be removed because of concerns that really aren't well founded. So he seems like he's a very good person to run Intel at this point, and Intel desperately needs the help. They need to take that company in a different, more streamlined, more efficient direction while they sort out the recipe for designing and manufacturing chips, which was a huge stumbling block for them. And that's why they're in the position they are, right? Why AMD has taken so much share from Intel over the years in server chips and elsewhere. So, this is a company we would avoid. We are avoiding at this point. We don't think it's a good place for investor money. There are just way too many uncertainties about the potential of Intel to make a comeback.
Meanwhile, the uncertainties loom large about access to China and what you have to pay to do that from an AMD and an Nvidia, but an uncertainty you're willing to swallow if the underlying tailwinds are still so strong. Make of it what you will. Tell us what you thought about the AMD and Nvidia deals.
Yeah, so clearly, right, the companies are better off with access to China than without, even with the 15% export tax. The potential revenue at risk, $30-ish billion for Intel, $6 to $10 billion for AMD, likely to potentially grow over time. So to pay 15% on that, it's going to cut into their margins to some degree. They probably get a 50%, 60% gross margin on those sales. I think that they're going to have to swallow this, right? They're charging what the market will bear right now for those chips, selling into China and elsewhere. I don't think they'll be able to pass on this tariff or this export tax to the Chinese customers. They're charging them as much as they can get away with already. So, it's definitely going to be a hit to margins on what is a minority part of their businesses. But it's better to have access than not. And I think the stocks are up because maybe this resolves the uncertainty. Maybe people will say, okay, they're going to have to pay this, but hey, now we can rely on the fact that they'll have these export licenses. Whereas before it was this sort of vague national security concern. No, you can't sell chips to China. Now that's gone away, right? It's clearly not a national security issue if the government is going to let them pay a fee to gain that access.
AMD put a statement out this morning saying they have an initial export license. They didn't address the 15% revenue split. Nvidia put out a statement saying they've not yet shipped any H20s to China for months, but they hope to. Can you and your desk analysts start modeling for some real China revenues in the near term from both those companies?
Yeah, I think, well, and from what we know, yes. I mean, it's good that AMD has confirmed they have the licenses. So I think we would definitely model in that 15% hit to revenue. And it's not clear, by the way, where this goes legally, right? It's unconstitutional to impose an export tax like this, but it's not clear who would have the legal standing to object to the tax. And clearly, Nvidia and AMD aren't going to, because they don't want to unbalance the apple cart here and risk those export licenses. But perhaps one of the business associations does. It's just unclear whether this shouldn't stand. But we're seeing more and more of these kinds of pay-to-play arrangements by the U.S. government that could increasingly put a tax on businesses. And it should be known, this is an ex post tax, right? This has happened after the fact of the companies having designed these chips and begun to sell them, and they want to sell more. What we worry about is that now companies are going to take this potentially into account. Do I want to develop the next chip, or do I want to develop the next, whatever medical device, if I'm going to be subject to a 15% revenue tax?
Joanne Feeney of Advisors Capital Management. We're out of time, but really grateful. Thank you. Now, coming up, Ford announces a, quote, tremendous pivot for its electric vehicle strategy. You're going to have those details next. This is Bloomberg Tech.
Time now for Talking Tech, and first up, Ford. It plans to invest $5 billion building a new line of budget EVs, starting at $30,000 mid-price pickup truck in 2027. Now, the move represents a massive shift in strategy for Ford. Efforts like the F-150 Lightning plug-in pickup just failed to meet lofty sales expectations. Plus, Paramount is spending $7.7 billion for exclusive rights to show the Ultimate Fighting Championship events in the United States. The deal covers the next 7 years and is designed to boost the company's streaming service. It, of course, comes just days after David Ellison closed his deal for control of Paramount. Ed, what are you looking at?
Okay, coming up, we speak with Bernstein senior analyst Stacy Rasgon as Nvidia and AMD agreed to pay 15% of their China chip revenues to the US government. We're going to get back to that story next. From London and from New York City, this is Bloomberg Tech. Welcome back to Bloomberg Tech. Let's get right back to our top story. Nvidia and AMD have agreed to share 15% of their revenues from China AI chip sales with the United States government. Bloomberg's reporting that, citing an anonymous source. Nvidia's basically flat. AMD's pushed higher since it confirmed it has been granted an initial export license, but neither of those companies in their statements have talked about the 15% revenue payment to the United States government at all. I'm looking, Kara, at the sell-side reaction, and it's pretty mixed. Yes, many say good to have access to the China market, but there is a number of names on Wall Street that say this sets a bad or worrying precedent, and I think one of those names is joining us now.
Stacy Rasgon's joining us, Bernstein senior analyst, to talk through the whole semiconductor spectrum. Stacy, we start with what you say initially. Look, 85% looks better than 0% in terms of revenues. But what is the precedent here? What is their long-term access to China, too?
Yeah, so I don't like the precedent that it sets. It feels like a very slippery slope. Again, like I said, 85% better than zero. I think it's better for them, both for them, as frankly, as well as for the U.S. in general, to be able to sell into China. Like, you don't want to hand the Chinese market for AI over to Huawei. We want to be able to compete there, so I think it's good. This idea of, like, I don't know what you want to call it, pay for play, or like export tax, or whatever you want to call it. I don't like it, though.
Quid pro quo.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's a slippery slope. Why does it stop here? Why does it stop with China AI? Why not other products, other companies? Ultimately, right. I mean,
well, Stacey,
I don't like it. Now, it's not up to me. But
well,
I don't
quite.
like
The reason I
precedent
jumped in, and Caroline, forgive me, but the reporting was really clear, right, citing the anonymous source, that it is a quid pro quo in the sense that it is 15% in exchange for an export license. That's what the reporting tells us. Have you got enough information on your desk now to model for what you think and when you think Nvidia and AMD can start booking that revenue?
So it'll let me put the 15% aside for a minute. They have to restart these supply chains. Both companies have some work in progress, not really any finished goods that they can just sell. They've got some work in progress that it was halted, that they can restart. It will take some time. It will take even more time if they have to start actually new wafers from the beginning of the process to run them through. That'll take, could be 6 months, even longer, 9 months maybe. So to the extent that they do ramp this up, it will take some time. Maybe you get a little bit. We had spoken with Nvidia about a month ago when the news came out that the licenses were getting
I'm sorry to
granted.
jump in. We'll be back with you in a moment, but President Trump is just speaking on this very topic. Just take a listen.
President Zelensky to join.
So you have to understand, this is a war that should have never happened. This is a war that wouldn't have happened if I were president. It would have never happened. It was the apple of his eye. I got along very well with President Putin. But if you look, under President Bush, they took a lot of territory.
Let's jump out. Sorry, Stacey, we return to you because he's just pivoted quickly away and now back on relationships with Russia and, of course, with Ukraine. But he was mentioning AMD and indeed the China relationship. And I go to you on that because longer term, what will AMD's access, what will Nvidia's access be to China? Because China doesn't seem thrilled thus far by what the sentiment is coming out of the US.
Yeah, I mean, look, so in terms of these things, by the way, like Nvidia has a roadmap with new products that are supposedly already compliant that they don't require a license for. So I don't know if they would have to kick back some of that once they get products actually below the threshold that they need a license anyways. And they do have a roadmap to sell in China. AMD's been a little less forthcoming about their future China roadmap, so I don't know what products they have that may go. Presumably they do have a roadmap, and we'll hear about it in due course. For the long term in China, though, I mean, you got to remember, like these thresholds are fairly punitive. China actually does have local products that have better performance than what both Nvidia and AMD are actually allowed to sell there. The benefits that Nvidia, and especially Nvidia, has is around ecosystem, which is why we don't want them shut off, because we do not want the local developers in China to coalesce around other local alternatives like Huawei. But you have to think, like, over time, the gap between what Nvidia and even AMD are allowed to sell in China versus what they're allowed to sell in the rest of the world is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. They're not going to really be allowed to improve the performance of these products in China to the extent that they could do it anywhere else. And the Chinese are going to do their best to improve the performance of their own products as much as they can, given the constraints that they're under. So, like, over time, look, China, it's a big market. Hopefully they will get some of it, but I mean, it's going to be a competitive market, and it probably will be impaired relative to to what they would be able to sell there if there were no constraints at all.
Stacey, Caroline and I had the opportunity to quiz Lisa Su about this in the middle of last week. I just wanted to play her thoughts on China right now.
90 days ago, we did not expect to be able to ship to China because of some of the regulations. I think this administration, the Department of Commerce, the government has actually been very open to trying to find the right balance between national security and ensuring that we have U.S. AI technologies proliferated across the world.
We've talked endlessly about Jensen Huang's ability to have a relationship with the president, but I just wondered if you give an evaluation of how Lisa Su's doing in D.C. right now.
I mean, like, she seems to be doing all right as well. You have to remember, Jensen's the dominant player here. Like, AMD, I mean, and more power to them. I mean, they've done very well given where they're coming from. But I mean, they'll do. They did $5 billion of sales overall in AI last year. I mean, Nvidia did, I don't know what it was, $100 billion. AMD said that the China ban, at the time cost them $1.5 billion this year. Nvidia will be 10x that or even more. So they're relatively small. But I think Lisa, like in terms of building her case to the administration and helping and trying to build that relationship with Trump, which for better or for worse is important. Is important. I think she's done a good job. At least
Stacy
she's been
Rasgon.
there. She's been present. She's been visible. Right. There are some other players in the industry that maybe have been a little less visible.
Stacy Rasgon of Bernstein, we thank you. We're actually going to head back to DC ourselves, where the president in his press conference is talking about Vladimir Putin and relations with Russia.
Or even a third-party place. But I think we'll have constructive conversations. Then after that meeting, immediately, maybe as I'm flying out, maybe as I'm leaving the room, I'll be calling the European leaders who I get along with very well. And, you know, I have a great relationship, I think, with all of them. And I get along with Zelensky, but, you know, I disagree with what he's done. Very, very severely disagree. This is a war that should have never happened, wouldn't have happened. But I'll be speaking to Zelensky. The next meeting will be with Zelensky and Putin, or Zelensky and Putin and me. I'll be there if they need. But I want to have a meeting set up between the two leaders. I was a little bothered by the fact that Zelensky was saying, well, I have to get constitutional approval. I mean, he's got approval to go into war and kill everybody, but he needs approval to do a land swap, because there'll be some land swapping going on. I know that through Russia and through conversations with everybody, to the good, for the good of Ukraine. Good stuff, not bad stuff. Also, some bad stuff for both. So there's good and there's bad. But it's very complex because you have lines that are very uneven, and there'll be some swapping, there'll be some changes in land, and the word that they will use is, you know, they make changes. We're going to change the lines, the battle lines. Russia's occupied a big portion of Ukraine. They've occupied some very prime territory. We're going to try and get some of that territory back for Ukraine. But they've taken some very prime territory. They've taken largely ocean, you know, in real estate we call it oceanfront property. That's always the most valuable property. If you're in a lake, a river, or an ocean, it's always the best property. Well, Ukraine, a lot of people don't know that Ukraine was largely 1,000 miles of ocean. That's gone. Other than one small area, Odessa, it's a small area. There's just a little bit of water left. So I'm going to go and see the parameters. Now, I may leave and say, good luck, and that'll be the end. I may say this is not going to be settled. I mean, there are those that believe that Putin wanted all of Ukraine. I happen to be one of them, by the way. I think if it weren't for me, he would not be even talking to anybody else right now. But I'm going to meet with him. We're going to see what the parameters are. I'm then going to call up President Zelensky and the European leaders right after the meeting, yeah. And I'm going to tell them what kind of a deal. I'm not going to make a deal. It's not up to me to make a deal. I think a deal should be made for both. I think Russia has to get back into building their country. It's a massive country. I think they have 11 time zones, if you can believe it. It's a massive, it's by far, from the standpoint of land, it's by far the largest. They have tremendous potential in Russia to do well. They're not doing well. Their economy is not doing well right now because it's been very well disturbed by this. It doesn't help when the President of the United States tells their largest or second largest oil buyer that we're putting a 50% tariff on you if you buy oil from Russia. That was a big blow. And then they say, gee, he wasn't so tough. Nobody else would have done that. And I haven't stopped there. I mean, look, I was all set to do things far bigger than that, but I got a call that they'd like to meet, and I'm going to see what they want to meet about. I'd like to see a ceasefire. I'd like to see the best deal that could be made for both parties. You know, it takes two to tango, right? So ultimately, I'll have a meeting next week. I had a great relationship with him, considering the fact that, you know, I was not nice to him because of the pipeline. I ended the pipeline. I also gave the javelins. Do you ever hear of a javelin? Javelin is called a tank buster. They say that Obama gave them sheets and I gave them javelins. If it weren't for me, all those tanks that were destroyed at the first days of the war because the tanks got stuck in the mud, some commander made a better. You know, they would have been in Kiev in 4 hours going down the highway. But a Russian general made a brilliant decision to go through the farmland instead. And they just had torrential rains, and the rains were so bad, and it was mud, and those tanks got stuck in the mud. I don't know who that general is, but knowing Vladimir, he's probably not around any longer because all those tanks were stuck in the mud, and they went along with the javelins. I gave them the javelins. You know that, right? I gave them javelins. They gave them sheets. But I'm going to I'm going to meet with President Putin, and we're going to see what he has in mind. And if it's a fair deal, I'll reveal it to the European Union leaders and to the NATO leaders, and also to President Zelensky. I think out of respect, I'll call him first, and then I'll call them after. And I may say, lots of luck, keep fighting, or I may say we can make a deal.
If not,
I will tell you this. I've seen a poll coming out of Ukraine. 88% of the people would like to see a deal made. And if you go back 3 years, everybody was gung-ho for war. You know, everybody's gung-ho for war until you have it. It's an amazing thing. I had it with a couple of countries where I couldn't get a deal done with one particular country. And I just couldn't. The guy's great. He's a friend of mine. Great. Good leader. Tough as hell. I couldn't get the deal done. And then he went into war for a short period of time. You know where I'm talking about. First term. And it was nasty. Guys being killed all over the place. And he went through 1 week of war, and I was able to get the deal done. He said, this is nasty. Yes, please.
Yeah, just to follow up on what you were saying there. First of all, Volodymyr Zelensky is not invited on Friday?
He wasn't a part of it. I would say he could go, but he's gone to a lot of meetings. You know, he's been there for 3.5 years. Nothing happened.
And what is the definition?
I mean, do you want somebody that's been doing this for 3.5 years? What's the definition of a good deal? I'll tell you after I hear what the deal is. Because there could be many definitions. You know, you're talking about a very large and complex situation. Now, I tell you, the war that I just settled with Azerbaijan and with, as you know, in Armenia was almost as complex as this one, having to do with routes, trade.
Meeting on Friday with Vladimir Putin.
Well, we're going to have a meeting with Vladimir Putin, and at the end of that meeting, probably in the first 2 minutes, I'll know exactly whether or not a deal can be made.
How will you know that?
Because that's what I do. I make deals.
Please go ahead. Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to ask you 2 questions, one about China, one about Russia, if I could. On China, your administration agreed to send the most advanced or advanced Nvidia and AMD chips.
No, obsolete. No.
Obsolete chip. Well, and then 15% of the profits.
You mean the 20s? No. This is an old chip that China already has. And I deal with Jensen, who's a great guy, and Nvidia. The chip that we're talking about, the H20, it's an old chip. China already has it in a different form, different name, but they have it. Or they have a combination of two will make up for it, and even then some. Now, Jensen Jensen's a very brilliant guy, and Jensen also has a new chip, the Blackwell. Do you know what the Blackwell is? The Blackwell is super duper advanced. I wouldn't make a deal with that, although it's possible I'd make a deal, a somewhat enhanced in a negative way Blackwell. In other words, take 30% to 50% off of it. But that's the latest and the greatest in the world. Nobody has it. They won't have it for 5 years. But the H20 is obsolete. You know, it's one of those things, but it still has a market. So I said, listen, I want 20% if I'm going to approve this for you, for the country, for our country, for the U.S. I don't want it myself. You know, every time I say like 747, I want, yeah, for the Air Force. So I just wanted, so when I say I want 20, I want for the country. I only care about the country. I don't care about myself. And he said, would you make it 15? So we negotiate a little deal. So he's selling a essentially old chip that Huawei has a similar chip, a chip that does the same thing. And I said, good, if I'm going to give it to you, because they have a, they have a stopper, what we call a stopper, not allowed to do it. It's really known as a restrictive covenant. And I said, if I'm going to do that, I want you to pay us as a country something, because I'm giving you a release. I released them only from the H20. Now, on the Blackwell, I think he's coming to see me again about that. But that will be a unenhanced version of the big one. Like, I don't know if you know it, we will sometimes sell fighter jets to a country, and we'll give them 20% less than we have. Do you know what I mean, right? That's the same.
So on Russia, do you see a time, Mr. President, when there could be normal trade between the U.S. and Russia? Should your meeting go well? Should there be peace?
I do, yeah. Russia has a very valuable piece of land. If Vladimir Putin would go toward business instead of toward war, you know, it's a warring nation. That's what they do. They fight a lot of wars. A friend of mine said Russia's tough because they just keep on fighting. They beat Hitler, so did we, and they beat Napoleon. You know, they've been doing this for a long time. I asked a question to a very, very smart man that some people like and some people don't like. Viktor Orban, right, from Hungary, the head of Hungary, and he's in that same area and knows the two countries very well. I said, this was before Biden didn't do anything to get us out of it. He could have gotten us out of that. It would have never happened. I said, so can Russia be beaten by Ukraine? He looked at me like, what a stupid question. He said, Russia's a massive country, and they win their country, and they win their life through wars. They fight wars. That's what they do. He said, China beats you with trade. Russia beats you with war. That was a very interesting statement. China's not beating us with trade, not when I'm in charge, but they were beating Biden with trade, but they never beat us with trade. Don't forget, China had to pay $400 billion worth of tariffs when I was last time. That was last time. And if we didn't have COVID, all of this stuff we would be loaded. We're finding hundreds of billions of dollars of cash is pouring into our country now because of tariffs. And all we're doing is we're doing what they do to us. It's so beautiful to see it. They found last month, as you saw, $25 billion of excess cash flow. They're saying, where did it come from? I said, I'll tell you where it came from. It came from a place called tariffs, and we're doing very well. We're really doing well. But I expect to have a meeting with Putin that I think it'll be good, but it might be bad. And I'm here for one reason, to get rid of a war that somebody else started. Should have never happened. And if I could end it, great. Complex war, a lot of bad blood, But Zelensky's been there for 3.5 years. So if you put him in a room, now I will say this, ultimately I'm going to put the two of them in a room. I'll be there or won't be there. And I think it'll get solved. Yeah, please be.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Excuse me, I'm going to suggest, because do you have any other questions on DC? Because I don't want them to be. Wait. These are incredible people. I don't want them to be standing up here on subjects that. Does anybody have a question of them? And then you guys can leave. Okay, a question, Brian, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President. All right.
And by the way, this is only on DC, and then they're going to leave because it's unfair to have them stand up here all day long.
I agree.
Brian.
I've got two questions for you. First, about DC. This is personal for me as well. Last year, I was robbed on the streets by one of these teenage thugs.
That was President Trump speaking at the White House, of course, in front of reporters, currently talking about planned meeting with Putin that he currently has in mind. Zelensky will not be part of Friday's Putin meeting, we understand. And Zelensky has gone to a lot of meetings already. He confirms he will make then a pivot to the world of technology and to chips. Trump says he wouldn't make a deal on Nvidia's new chip. He's therefore referencing the Blackwell chip system. Initially, when talking about H20s, he said he wanted a 20% tariff if he approved chip exports, but we understand he managed to negotiate down. Nvidia's Jensen Huang negotiated to a 15% deal on a chip deal, confirming that 15% chip payment that will go from Nvidia on an H20 to the US government. Nvidia's H20, he says, is obsolete, but still has a market. But he thinks Jensen Huang is coming back to see him, he says, about the Blackwell chips. Let's go to Joe now, Joe Matthew, who is back to break it all down with us. There was a lot about Russia, there's a lot about geopolitics, but there's a lot about China as well. Joe, just for the technology audience, talk to us a little bit about what you learned in the Nvidia context.
Well, he confirmed that 15%. So Bloomberg, as usual, was ahead of the curve with this reporting. But to go on to suggest that there could be a deal involving Blackwell, I think might be the closest thing that we have to news here. What he said is, I wouldn't make a deal with that, referring to Blackwell, although it's possible I would make a deal, he said. A somewhat enhanced, in a negative way, Blackwell taking off 30 to 50% of it, I think suggesting that somehow there would be a lower powered version of Blackwell. I suspect that Jensen Huang would have some things to say about that when they do meet again. But the idea here that we could see continued changes in Nvidia's export controls and relationship with China, I suspect that goes for AMD as well. It's quite remarkable to hear the president riffing on this in front of reporters today.
OK, Bloomberg's Balance of Power host Joe Matthew, the blow-by-blow of what President Trump had to say. Caro, there's a lot more coming up to discuss on the show.
It certainly is. Nvidia, AMD, we return in a moment with our own Tom Giles. This is Bloomberg Tech.
Let's get back to our top story. Bloomberg had reported Nvidia and AMD both agreed to pay 15% of their revenue from Chinese AI chip sales to the US government. In the last few minutes, President Trump has confirmed at least some of that in Nvidia's case. Bloomberg senior executive editor for tech, Tom Giles, is in San Francisco. What do we need to know?
Yeah, well, this has very little precedent. This demonstrates just how important the Chinese market is to these companies. They really want to be able to sell their most advanced chips into the Chinese market. They've hit a buzzsaw from the Trump administration, which has placed really strict limits on what they can and can't do. It's in the middle of negotiations with the Chinese government over tariffs, and so this shows that the Trump administration wants to cut deals, wants a cut of the sales of these chips. It's willing to turn a blind eye to the sale of advanced artificial intelligence chips into the Chinese market if it can get a return. But this is going to complicate trade negotiations going forward.
We thank you, Tom Giles, for wrapping up the latest as DC crosses paths with San Francisco. But that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Tech Ed.
Yeah, the bit we didn't get to, we think Intel's CEO is going to meet with President Trump later today. So overnight, we'll look for a read on that. So much to recap on the podcast. The focus on Nvidia and AMD. You know where to find the pod. It's on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, and all of your Bloomberg platforms. From London and New York City, this is Bloomberg Tech.